Yeah, actually, the virtual environment is really new for many people. So let's hear experiences and opinions from Samu. Samu is, I've already mentioned, he's an architect and urban planner. He is a co-founder and content director of the KEG, Hungarian Contemporary Architecture Center. And he works on the development of urban services and the coordination of smart city programs in Hungary. You might heard Samu talking at the Recite conference a few years ago, or also you might have heard of him on some other online conferences. So let's hear his opinion. And yeah, Samu, welcome on the stage.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me now. I'm quite used to these lectures, but it's always a weird feeling like you're in some sort of a spiritual, session looking for ghosts. But I'm going to share my presentation and start. And what I wanted to share with you is rather a number of questions and concerns, because I think that just as there aren't any overall recipes for designing exhibitions, there are no overall recipes for designing online exhibitions either. But I think there are a number of concerns and questions when we think about online exhibitions, whether we do that because of the pandemic or whether we have done it before because of online culture's dominance. That should be concerned, that should be thought about, and that should maybe look at how we could find the right balance between virtual and physical parts of exhibitions. And what I wanted to start with is one of my favorite artifacts that is a wooden scale model of the downtown of Budapest, the city where I live and work. That was commissioned in 1976 by the chief architect of the city. And this is a modular model that was meant to be used as a working tool for urban planning. And the idea was that you have these roughly 1 by 1 meter units from which the whole city model is built at a scale of 1 to 500. And then whenever there was a project planned and to be discussed, then one or several of these modules would have been brought forward, and the scale model of the plans would be inserted into the model as the houses can be removed from the model. So it's a highly mobile thing. And then this would be the platform for discussion. And I think, although this has been forgotten for quite some time now, I think there are some remarkable features of this model that are actually almost impossible to replicate when you go online. So, of course, it would be very easy to just dismiss this model as a very large, very slow, very expensive, difficult to use, expensive to maintain, and then just use Google Earth instead. But I think if you look at it from an interaction design and an experience design standpoint, then there's a number of remarkable features that will lead us to thinking about how exhibitions, what are some of the key features of exhibitions in physical space, and what are the questions that we should be concerned with when we think of moving exhibitions online. So if we go back to the model, I think first of all, it's the experience of scale that you are actually standing in a space that you have an overview of, and you have an overview as a physical, tangible experience of this entire model, which is, as you see, very large, and it provides you both an overview and an ability to zoom into the details at the same time. Of course, you can do this on a screen with the digital map too, but you will never get this kind of tangible overview of what's in front of you. This is even something that you can experience with a paper-based map. And the second thing is the scale of the buildings. That is a very well-chosen scale for an installation, because buildings which are just schemes of volumes, so very reduced in their appearance, work quite well in this at this scale, but also buildings that have been built as scale replicas with highly detailed features on the facades also work well. So if in terms of user experience, you're looking at an object that can provide many features that are almost impossible to replicate online. So I think the lessons that, and this is what I'm going to argue basically for in this presentation, is that the key features of exhibitions and museum spaces and gallery spaces are the spaces themselves. So they provide a very rich experience of being embedded in an environment, whether that environment is a white cube or some other exhibition space, where the space itself is just as important as the content which is embedded in the space. It provides a scale of understanding, comparison to our own bodies, especially if we talk about design exhibitions. Although this is a design week, exhibitions, of course, feature many things, but I have some examples with me in this presentation that are from design exhibitions. So I think scale, the human body, the relationship between our perception of the environment and the artifacts on display is highly important. And it also provides a context. So whether that's the venue or the museum or the other exhibited materials, because most exhibitions feature several artifacts and visualizations and other content, they provide a rich environment that is at the same time a physical experience. And this is something that is almost impossible to replicate, but we can break this down into features that could be used as design tools when we think about online exhibitions. So just to quote some examples, how spaces can be used and how this is gradually being transformed nowadays. You can break an environment down to artifacts, such as the case of this exhibition at the Venice Biennale a couple of years ago, where used and removed, demolished pieces of interiors were exhibited as artifacts, such as pieces of floors and carpets and staircases, where these generic parts of the environment were transformed into objects or artifacts to be looked at as artworks. So suddenly you have a completely different understanding and an approach to a piece of the architectural environment, which is kind of recontextualization, very much using the space as a tool to break this down and to highlight some of the features. Or in some other exhibitions, in the case of an exhibition on the work of Oma, Ome, the Dutch architecture office, the play with scales is something that tells you a lot about the work of an architecture office, whether you see sort of hundreds of models amassed on tables as a kind of a huge volume of objects that you really cannot contemplate as one by one, or the whole environment of physical models, architectural models blown up to the scale of a human environment, as you can see on the image on the right. So this kind of play with scales is of course something that can be done easily on a website or in an online environment, but in this case, it's the added value is the physical experience of the perception of this with others, simultaneously relating to others and relating to the content. Or you can go the other way around, where in some design exhibitions, the generic objects are broken down into individual, almost artworks, as in the case of this famous exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery, where the objects that were on display are general everyday tools. So they were not designed to be highlights of interiors or our environment, but they were stripped of context. So in this case, the context is the I'm sorry, so the context is a white cube, wherein the general objects were removed from their everyday context, and this is what provides an additional meaning. So whichever way we're going, exhibitions are always used to tell stories in space. And when we move exhibitions online, or when we contemplate providing online features to our exhibitions, it's usually the space that gets lost and that provides or that needs to be replicated in some other way in an online environment. Otherwise, we end up with basically media content. So just to provide a very rough outline of a more general trend, of course, this question didn't start last year. It just highly intensified with the pandemic and the closure of galleries and museums. But the entire shift in the perception of exhibitions has been happening in the last 2 decades, and especially in the last decade, where besides offline culture or general the 20th century culture, the influence of online culture has been an increasing pressure on how exhibitions are formatted and how they're communicating and finding their audience. I mean, these are very generalizing concepts here, so don't take them too seriously. But I think the general shift, the most general shift that you can see is the fact that we're moving from a written culture to an oral culture in terms of understanding exhibitions and artifacts and artworks. So the whole perception shifts from a knowledge-based individual perspective on artworks to a social perspective that is shared and that is increasingly focusing on reflection. And so exhibitions as artifacts themselves, as curatorial concepts, are less and less about the closed, you could say, creation of a curator or curatorial team that is providing an assemblage of content which is existing in and of itself, but rather an open system where the exhibited content and artifacts are actually providing the platform for an ever broadening and open system of content creation in which the participants, the visitors are also participating. So this has been happening as a kind of longer term, and we all know how museums have been trying to adopt in social media feeds and communication and programming around exhibitions. But all of a sudden, we could feel last year that everything, all the stuff that we're left with is really the second one, the oral part, the social media part, and the way to survive is to actually move content online and to this, you know, as we're not able to negotiate offline environments and to focus on this entirely. But I think that this is risking losing the key focus and the key purpose of museums and galleries as public venues. And so, although I don't have any real solutions, as I said at the beginning, I'm offering a number of questions to consider when we're thinking about moving exhibitions online. So of course, each museum and each large institution has several components in their content, such as here, what I'm showing is the permanent exhibition of the Estonian National Museum, where you definitely have the ability to visit the exhibition in the Google Art infrastructure, so you can actually have a street view-like experience walking through the exhibition. But it's of course, always going to be different than going there and perceiving it yourself. And again, this is always added on with this kind of fast-moving online content creation of social media, as with this image that I've taken from Bernie Sanders from the social media feed of the museum with the knit gloves. And of course, today, when we talk about an exhibition, we talk about all of these things. And but the question is, you know, what do you lose when you lose the experience of the immediate physical environment? There are some interesting arguments about that, but one that I would like to quote here is an article by Emma Thorne Christie, who says that there are three key factors that we risk when disregarding the physical, the offline environments. And these are all related to space, which is my key concern. So the first one is the ability and the experience of stumbling upon and being surprised by exhibitions. Very few of us go to museums and exhibitions having a full knowledge of what we're going to see there. And so it has a huge effect, it's a huge factor in visiting museums and galleries, of being able to be surprised and to find things, whether that's artifacts or content or other people, that we didn't expect. And this is enabled by the space, by the spatial arrangement of exhibitions. And this kind of serendipity is something that almost completely doesn't exist, or it's driven by algorithms entirely in social media. So it's a very dubious thing to look at in online culture, and it's something also that people are used to. They're used to being recommended new content and disregarding it routinely. So it's something that space provides as an entirely different quality. The second key point is the ability or the sort of controls of tuning out. When you look at online exhibitions, it's very easy to switch immediately to social media or to news feeds or to emails or to another task. Whereas if you're in a gallery, it's much more difficult to switch tasks, and so you have to physically leave the space in order to to start or to switch to another activity. So it kind of helps you focus the attention of the visitors to the story that you want to tell. And then the third one, and this is especially interesting in the case of artworks, of course, is the experience of the original, and we can go back all the way to Walter Benjamin and the aura and you know, in the age of reproduction. But still, in the 21st century, the idea of the original versus the digitized replica is something that I think is interesting to look at, even if we have a different kind of perspective on it than in the early 20th century. So if we look at, you know, a couple of examples here, this is an ongoing exhibition now at the Museum of Fine Arts in Budapest, which is trying to provide some kind of a spatial structure to an exhibition that would otherwise be taking place in a physical space, where you have the sections and you can zoom in the sections, and then within the sections you can navigate between the images, but ultimately what you're left with is images on a black screen. So you're essentially, you know, looking at an image gallery. There are, of course, several galleries that have been experimenting with going more physical and trying to provide some experience of the space, as the case here with this gallery, where you have a sort of basic navigation in the space where you can see the relationship of various images to each other, and there's also a way to have this kind of augmented content that you can click on. And then the exhibition also has interviews, podcasts, and various other content as a kind of package that you can visit, which I think works in a much better way. It gives back some of that physical experience that you would be experiencing if you visit the actual space. But there's a whole range of these things. So you can go from the most minimal online slideshow through the examples that we've seen to much more elaborate packages of content, some of which include a lot of efforts in providing or developing custom digital content with VR, very hardware intensive gaming environments or social media engagements. And I think the key question here for all of the institutions or the curators, should you or should we want to become digital media producers? Should we want to try to compete with online media, data visualization and news feeds and others? And I think it's a big risk that we're moving towards if we are thinking to provide exhibitions and the stories of exhibitions as news stories with rich media and galleries and snippets of interviews. There is something more that we should be looking at and looking for. And I think if we go forward, the important concern is rather to strip down the content of exhibitions to the minimum that is the most difficult to reproduce in a digital environment, and look at, you know, what is the stuff, what is the core of a concept that cannot be replicated, and that is the essential part of the content. So some of the, and of course there are some new things that we can consider. I think institutions can start working more with urban space. Cake has had a lot of experience with developing urban walks, a program that I'm sure all of you know. But there's a lot of potential in developing various contents about urban walks, whether you organize a walk for a group in an open space when you have a lockdown, as we have today. We've had lockdown, including curfews, since November last year. But urban walks are still happening because you can go outside and spend some time outside. Museums and institutions are very rarely concerned with their immediate urban environments, and we've had a number of programs where we are trying to encourage museums and cultural institutions to become more interested in developing content for their immediate neighborhoods. This is a potential that museums can use. The other idea is using personal context. The space that you can work with is the space of the visitor, whether that visitor comes into your physical space and then you have the ability to control that through the gallery and the venue itself, or whether you're using their space, which is their living room from where they're browsing your site. You can relate to that personal context. So you can have a more reflected view on the institutional context here, as these are photographs that I've taken within about 2 hours of each other in Naples last year, of an exhibition and of a street butcher shop. And you can always, as an institution, reflect on what's happening around you and develop content and exhibitions around that at times when you don't have the ability to provide an actual physical experience. So to sum up, I would like to leave you with a number of questions. I think when we look at developing new exhibitions, instead of thinking about how we can formulate a good online content, I think some of the questions that we have to think about are about the choice of context that I just laid out before. So what are the spaces? What contexts are the ones that we want to relate to? What are the components of these that are not replicable? And I think this is the advantage of the exhibition in a physical format, and this is what we should definitely focus on, to provide elements of exhibitions that are impossible to experience physically, unless you go there physically or unless you go somewhere physically, whether that's your living room, your street, or the institution's environment. It's the curator's choice. We should, I think, curators and institutions should also be very clever about how they draw the boundaries around exhibitions, because it's very easy to expand into the infinite when we think about what kind of content we can pull in to an online exhibition, because there are so many archives and images and other sort of content online. Second is about the experience. How can we keep the visitor focused on the content? Do we compete with mass media? Is our exhibition like an article that they read in a news feed? How can we make it somehow in a different way so that we don't lose the visitor's focus, but we also potentially offer the ability to be surprised? And finally, how do we avoid being a competitor in an online media world and not become another news feed? How can we still provide kind of a digital toolkit for visitors to use our content for their benefit? How long will this last? What is the expiry date of an online exhibition? Is it taken down because we say we've closed it, or is it taken down because the technology is obsolete after a year? Is it taken down because the only thing that remains is a database that can be reused by coders? I think these are very conscious choices when we are looking at curating exhibitions. But I would urge everyone who is thinking of moving online and of course, as a way to survive and to keep visitors and also potentially to engage new audiences, to think about the physical experience first and then add the online to that as a toolkit. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks a lot, Samu. I'd like to remind everyone in the audience, we have Q&A session, and there is the Q&A feature in the panel, in the navigation panel. Also, in case that the navigation panel for Q&A wouldn't work for you, feel free to place your question into the chat. Actually, Samu, like you put many questions in the end, and I think that we all need maybe a few minutes just to think about the answers, and sure that like on many answers, like many questions we don't know the answer really, because it's really new situation for all of us. And you mentioned the hybrid exhibitions as well, and of course creating the content or exhibition for online or offline, there are different rules for it. And is it actually sustainable and affordable for curators and their institution to create actually two different exhibitions, because each format is different? So what do you think? What is your experience? And also how to make it affordable, because I think there is also question of money.
Yes, of course. I mean, as I said as well, that of course, if you're the Smithsonian or MoMA, you have a different set of resources to work with than if you're a small private gallery. But still, I think I've shown both. One of my favorite examples, in fact, from the presentations, is actually was developed by a private gallery, although it's one of the larger ones. But I would think that the only point where I would choose to put a lot of effort and resources into digital exhibitions is if, as an institution or as a curator, you want to be focused on that in the long term. So if the pandemic is not your immediate, emergency, but rather a way for you to imagine your future. In our case, we started to focus on digital exhibition content with Cake as something that would augment our physical exhibitions, because we are generally very much interested in using data and and data-driven tools in creating cultural content. So, for example, if we make an exhibition about, I've shown on some of the images, we made an exhibition about the future of, and the present of an industrial zone in Budapest. We developed a very large database with 2 years of field work behind our work. And in fact, we think that the database is more important than the actual exhibition we made. So we found it was a very important feature for us, and it's something that we want to use, because this database is something that we can provide for analysis, for coders, for people who want to work with it. So I think the point where you would want to make this is where, if you want to invest this in the long term, and if you're interested in that, and if you're an institution that is stuck in this current situation, then I wouldn't burn too many resources on actually providing, as you said, 2 separate exhibitions. Although I think nobody can really escape this kind of online data-driven logic of cultural production, and also cultural consuming culture in the long run. So I think everyone should be working on this, but not so much as a kind of response to an emergency, but in a much more strategic way. So I guess the answer is yes and no. So be very, very resource conscious about what you're putting into it. And as I think some exhibitions really only work physically. And then you have to decide whether you want to do that now, or whether you want to postpone it for a later date, because these are so strong experiences that, especially now that people haven't had these experiences sometimes for years, if you can do that a year from now, when you have the ability, it's going to be much more, it's impactful. But if you have any way to turn that around and to use public space, to use some other tools to create this kind of physical or physical-like experiences, this kind of density of experience that you have in a physical exhibition, then you should go for it. And I think it's going to provide you as a curator, as an institution, with new tools for the future as well. So I very much hope that anyone who's investing and thinking seriously about how to do exhibitions now will come out much richer in the end, in terms of toolkits and ability to format new content.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Another question: how do you think that cities and cities in general will change because of the pandemic? So it means like constantly we need to sanitize ourselves, we need to keep the social distance. So what do you think that will be the impact of these new rules on the cities and the public space?
Small question. So, well, I think it's difficult to assess what the long-term effects will be, but some people already say that it's going to have an imprint on a generation like the Second World War had on our grandparents' generation, in a sense that you are very much confined to a certain way of living for a long duration. So that's going to have sort of psychological effects. I'm not sure about that, but I think what we can say is that I think it definitely forces us to rethink what public spaces are, what community spaces are, and what our relationship to these spaces are. You can see the effects on the workplace. Of course, many companies, not multinationals, but smaller ones, institutions, public administration, whoever has not been involved with online work before, have been forced to do that. And now many of them realize that it actually works to some degree. Of course, you also have the experience of how much toll that's taking. I think a lot of people in the creative industries have been used to working remotely or as freelancers from their homes before, but it's a different sort of environment. So I think what I hope to see is that it's going to be more resource conscious in the long run. So, for example, with many meetings, you realize that you don't have to travel to a different country or a different city for a conference. You can actually do that. I mean, of course, it would be much better for me to be in Zlín and to have the physical experience that I've talked about in my presentation as well. But if we think about the the amount of carbon dioxide or the sort of economic or the environmental footprint of this conference or the entire Lean Design Week. If you don't organize this conference offline and you don't have hundreds of people traveling there, you probably save a lot for the environment. And this might sound as a sort of a demagogic attitude, but if you look at it on a scale of a city, I think you can become much smarter about how you use your resources, learning from the experience here. Maybe one last quick point. For us, especially with Cake, it was a absolutely shocking experience about a year ago when the whole first wave started and the country went into a lockdown, which pretty much was self-imposed. There weren't any sort of central regulations to the degree that we have now. And the first couple of months had absolutely unexpected diversity and scale of community effort going into helping each other. So there were all sorts of initiatives in the smallest places, in small towns, in Budapest, everywhere around the country, where people were doing shopping for elderly. They were delivering food and medicine and all sorts of things that were all of a sudden very difficult to do on a daily basis. And I think this really showed a completely different face of Hungary in our case. As you all know, we have a pretty wild political and public environment in recent years, and this was showing a completely different perspective on the country. And I think this is probably largely true to most countries, that you have a different sort of engagement with your community and the place where you live. And I think this is a potential that many cities and also many cultural institutions should be using in the future. Mm-hmm. So we've actually developed a database around that as well. So we are sort of trying to make a toolkit around that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good at sharing the data that you collected for maybe future planning, and also thinking about our neighborhoods and how public spaces look like and what we actually need. Okay, that's great. So thank you very much, Samu.
Thank you for having me.
And
I'm looking forward to the other presentations.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. And I'd like to welcome Caroline Simbers now on stage. Caroline is